Hello everybody, it's almost Midsummer Day, and today I want to talk about fairies and elves in honor of Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. What comes to mind when you think of fairies? Do you think of illustrations in children's picture books, or maybe Tinkerbell from Peter Pan? When someone says the word elves, do you think of Legolas from Lord of the Rings, or maybe Christmas elves at the North Pole? The fairies and elves in old folklore were actually very different from how we imagine them today. In fact, they were originally somewhat interchangeable concepts, powerful non-human beings that were dangerous at best and malicious at worst. I talked in my last video about fairies and elves in ballads, and I will put a link to that video right there so that you can check it out. But in this one, I want to talk a little bit more about other forms of folklore and literature. If you have a little bit of familiarity with older versions of fairies and elves from folklore, you're probably familiar with the Irish and Scottish versions. Now, many cultures across Europe and across the world have beings that are somewhat similar to elves or fairies. However, it's the Scottish and Irish versions that are the most well-known. In Irish folklore, for instance, they're called the fair folk, among other things. They live in fairy mounds under the earth, and if you're not careful, they might steal away your newborn child and replace it with a changeling. Scottish folklore divides the fairies into two main groups, the Seelie and Unseelie courts. In very simplistic forms, those are the good ones and the bad ones, the Seelie being the good and the Unseelie being the bad. However, it's really not that simple. One group was supposed to be more benevolent towards humans, but they were still dangerous and unpredictable. We're not talking about Cinderella's fairy godmother here, we will get to her later. Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream came out in the 1590s, and it tones fairies down a whole lot as compared to older folklore, but it's still very far removed from how we imagine them today. So Titania, Oberon, and Puck are totally inhuman and amoral, but they interact in mostly positive ways with the humans that they encounter. For instance, their interference with the four lovers who are wandering in the woods results in chaos, but is ultimately resolved with two happy couples getting married. The play is a comedy, so what the fairies get up to is mostly portrayed as being funny rather than frightening, and they don't usually seem to mean any harm. However, they don't really adhere to human morals, and they do very much complicate the lives of the humans that they interact with. It might surprise you to know that in a lot of versions of Cinderella, Cinderella doesn't have a fairy godmother. In the version recorded by the Grimm brothers, for instance, she goes to the tree under which her dead mother was buried, and her mother's spirit is the one who helps her. Now, that one was actually recorded after the fairy godmother had already become a thing, but just in a different culture, because the fairy godmother comes from the French version, but the Grimm brothers, of course, recorded the German version. There are Cinderella variants around the world, and some of them involve supernatural helpers, some don't, but the fairy godmother specifically seems to come from the version by Charles Perrault. It was published in 1697, and it's probably the closest earlier version to the Disney one. There are other French fairy tales as well, both by Charles Perrault and by other writers of roughly the same time period, that involve fairies being benevolent helpers as opposed to mischievous and dangerous. However, there are also instances of fairies in fairy tales that really don't behave in such helpful ways. For instance, if you've watched Disney's Sleeping Beauty, you probably remember the three good fairies that give Aurora blessings when she is born, the third of which is that she won't die from Maleficent's curse. But did you know that in other versions the Maleficent equivalent was also a fairy? Really, the only difference in a lot of versions of Sleeping Beauty between the three good fairies and the Maleficent-type character is that she wasn't invited to the party. The implication, then, is that any of them might have chosen to curse the princess if their invitation hadn't arrived. Disney downplays this a whole lot, and that makes sense because they usually portray fairies in a very sweet and benevolent way. And so in Disney's Sleeping Beauty, Maleficent is not mentioned to be a fairy and certainly doesn't appear at all like the three good fairies. In the end, she turns into a dragon, and so one is left wondering, was she a dragon in human form, a human witch who could turn into a dragon? There's no implication that she's a fairy. But in the older versions, yeah, the one that cursed Sleeping Beauty was just another fairy who didn't get her invitation. Speaking of fairies in Disney, let's talk about Tinkerbell. Peter Pan is sometimes described as a fairy tale, but it really technically is not. It's actually based on a novel that was published in the early 20th century. In the novel, Tinkerbell and the fairies that live in Wonderland more generally are not really sweet, benevolent, innocent little creatures. The novel says that because they are so small, they only have the capacity for one emotion at a time, and so if that emotion is anger or jealousy, you better watch out. Tinkerbell herself is very silly, shallow, selfish, and very prone to jealousy. And at one point she actually tries to get Wendy killed because she's jealous of Peter wanting to spend time with Wendy when she wants him all to herself. The Disney movie tones Tinkerbell down a lot. They tone a lot of things down a lot. The original Peter Pan novel is super disturbing, but this is not the video for that. I'll probably make one about that at some point in the future. In any case, even in the Disney movie Peter Pan, though, Tinkerbell is not a little angel. She still has a bad attitude, and she's still jealous and selfish. Over time, though, the Disney character of Tinkerbell has evolved into just a sweet little fairy, and our modern idea of fairies outside of like specific ones from Disney movies or whatever has definitely evolved into something that's very far removed from all those old folk tales and ballads. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you liked it and you want to see more from me, be sure to subscribe. I post new videos on Mondays and Thursdays.